Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the DG Reading Club, one of our regular free online events in which we interview the journalists responsible for some of our very favourite pieces to feature in the magazine. My name is Marcus Webb, I'm one of the co-founders of DG, and tonight's edition features Matthew Lee, another of our co-founders, speaking with Nadia Noor-Yezden, the writer behind The Long Walk Home from issue 39. Nadia's piece was one of a series we've run looking at how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted the world. It tells the stories of India's lockdown and the incredible impact it had on the second most populous country on earth. As always, we welcome your questions. If you could enter those into the chat window below, then I'll be putting those to Nadia later in the evening. In the meantime, it's over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Marcus. I remember the first time I read Nadia's story. I put a few comments on the document saying things like, can we double check these figures? And are you sure this is right? Because some of the numbers were so shocking, it was quite hard to comprehend the scale of what was happening in India. But there weren't any typos, the numbers were correct. Indians really had been only given 4 hours notice of one of the world's strictest lockdowns. Tens of millions of internal migrant workers had been forced to travel from cities to their rural home villages by foot, usually after losing their jobs. The interviewees Nadia spoke to really did walk 300 miles or more to get home, walking day and night, sometimes in 35-degree heat, without food or water, often with young children by their side. And at least 80 people died on the overcrowded trains that the government introduced to try and transport these people home. The figures were really shocking. And aside from being a fantastic piece of journalism, Nadia's article drew attention to a humanitarian crisis that not many people outside of India had heard about at all, which is perhaps understandable considering it took place in March and April of this year. And it was one of many subplots in arguably the biggest global story of our lifetimes. So we're going to start with Nadia reading an excerpt from the very beginning of the article. Over to you, Nadia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone who's here right now. I'm going to read the opening of the piece, which takes us back to March of this year, which really doesn't feel that long ago. So it opens with the announcement of the lockdown in India and the sort of panic that sets in. At 8 p.m. on the night of 24th March 2020, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was giving a national broadcast about the coronavirus pandemic. At that point, India had recorded 564 cases of COVID-19 and 10 deaths. The entire country shall go under complete lockdown, he said. To save India, to save its every citizen, from midnight tonight, a full ban is being imposed on people stepping out of their homes. India's population of 1.3 billion was given 4 hours' notice of the imposition of one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. Minutes after Modi's speech, chaos set in. The absence of details about essential goods and services meant that there was suddenly a deluge of people and cars on the roads, queues at pharmacies and cash machines, and a palpable wave of panic. In the more affluent neighborhoods of the capital, Delhi, the shelves of off-licenses were emptied, and in the busy bylanes of East Delhi, crowds of people jostled in grocery stores, trying to buy flour, milk, and oil. An hour's drive away in Faridabad, police patrolled the streets in jeeps, blaring out warnings about the 21-day lockdown and the imposition of Section 144 of the Indian Penal Code, which bans any congregation of more than 4 people in a public place. In Faridabad's urban slums, it would be almost impossible to adhere to the government's orders. The city is the 8th fastest growing in the world, and its rapid urbanization has meant an influx of workers from poorer states who perform manual labor on construction sites for as little as 200 rupees per day. living in densely packed tenements or roadside huts and sharing toilets with up to 100 people. These daily wage laborers had no way to maintain social distancing, and without a source of income, they were at risk of starvation. This was Vimla Devi's main concern when India's lockdown was announced. Living in a tenement near Ankhir Chowk, a busy intersection in Faridabad, she didn't know how her family would survive the next 21 days. Like many other interstate migrant workers in India, she and her husband had traveled from their home in the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh to find work in Faridabad. On good days, construction labor could earn the couple 400 rupees. With this, they would feed their son and daughter, pay rent and loan installments, and send money back to their parents in their home village. But with Modi's announcement, construction sites halted all work and the subcontractor had nothing to offer Devi and her husband. We spent those days worrying about where we would be able to get our next meal, when we would be able to eat, she says. Work had totally stopped and we didn't have any money. So we left.
Thank you, Nadia. Firstly, I'd like to ask you why you wanted to write this story.
So like you said, this has been a difficult year. We've seen a lot of catastrophes, apart from the pandemic, compounded by the pandemic. But I think living in India and watching this story unfold, it was very difficult not to want to do something about it or help in some way. We had 30 million in internal migrants, and that's a conservative estimate. 30 million people in extreme stress within just a few days of the lockdown announcement. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of it. The last migration in human history, the largest migration in human history before this was the partition of India, and that was just 14 million people, just to put it in perspective. So the images that we saw in March, April, and May, I think were really shocking to a lot of people, myself included, because migrants have been invisible for so long. The images were really gut wrenching. There were crowds of people with everything they own waiting at inoperational bus stops. They were being beaten by the police. They were being made to squat down while they were sprayed with chemical disinfectant. There were children sitting next to the bodies of their parents. So it was really impossible not to feel empathy and not to feel the need to do something. And people did. Organizations came together, individuals came together to help in whatever capacity they could. And, this was what was in my capacity to do to help, was to sort of give the voices of migrants a platform and, let them tell their own stories. And I felt this especially because I guess the nature of news cycles in any country nowadays means that there's a lot of context and a lot of nuance that gets lost. And we saw that happen here as well with the more sensational stories of the girl who cycled 1,000 kilometers, or the women who had to give birth and then continue walking. So I was really grateful to have the opportunity not only to tell the story of this exodus, but to also look at the structural problems that allowed a situation like this to take place, to be able to critique a government whose response was really reprehensible, and to also dig a little deeper, because the story doesn't end where the migrants' journeys end.
Did the pandemic make it challenging getting access to interviewees? And were the internal migrants you spoke to happy to share their experiences with you?
Yeah, it was a tricky piece to report because interviews had to be done over the phone or over video call. Internet was spotty in villages. There were dialect issues, and so at the start, I was a little apprehensive about being able to find people who were willing to relive the trauma that they had just experienced. But once I started talking to people, uh, their stories just kind of flowed out of them. I sort of sat back, I put my questions away, and I just let them say what was on their mind. I think through this crisis, they've been seen as this sort of anonymous mass of people who were really dispensable. And so I think having someone pay attention to what they were saying and to really listen was important. And I was also very conscious of letting them have that space and tell their story in their own words. Um, I was it was also a little tricky for me because all of my sources were in dire need of help, right? They were in dire need of money. um, there was one woman who I had interviewed. She was a widow with 3 kids, and she called me a few days later, and she just broke down over the phone because she literally had no one else to go to ask for help. With Kusum, the woman in the story whose husband died while they were walking back, I had a mental health professional on the call as well because that was the priority. So, there were really distressing situations that people were continuing to be in even as I spoke to them, and they were anxious and angry and depressed, but they were also very willing to speak to me.
One of the internal migrants you spoke to, Raunak Parveen, wasn't only in a situation where she had to walk hundreds of miles home from the city she worked in because she lost her job. She also faced bigotry and discrimination because she is Muslim. Can you tell us a little bit about the Islamophobia and the propaganda that spread in India around the time of that first lockdown, such as the Corona Jihad hashtag that spread on social media?
Yeah. Well, Islamophobia in India is not new. But it has been on the rise since Modi's BJP government came into power in 2014. Many BJP leaders have made anti-Muslim statements and have either looked away or even encouraged attacks against Muslims. And in fact, the lockdown was announced just a few weeks after a particularly violent communal riot in Delhi where Hindu mobs attacked a peaceful protest and mosques were set on fire and property was destroyed, and 53 people died. The majority of them were Muslim. So it was during this really intense atmosphere that this Islamic missionary organization, the Tablighi Jamaat, held a large gathering, which turned out to be a COVID hotspot. And this wasn't the only religious gathering that happened, but it was the one that BJP members focused on. They called the Jamaat meeting a Talibani crime, and they sort of accused Muslims of having some sort of bioterrorism plot. And so the hashtag Corona Jihad went viral. Videos of Muslims allegedly spitting in food or infecting water supplies were forwarded on social media. And that really translated into real life consequences for many Muslims. There were attacks on people, including Muslim volunteers who were distributing relief materials. Posters stating "No Muslims allowed" were put outside neighborhoods. Muslims were turned away from certain hospitals unless they could prove that they were COVID free. So it was incredibly troubling that COVID was being used to excuse and to exacerbate discrimination against Muslims. And Ronak felt that personally, while the other two migrant families in the story left to go home, she and her husband were so scared that they would be caught and detained by officials if they tried to go back simply because they were Muslim. And they were hiding in this one-room apartment for weeks, living with this very real fear. She had trouble accessing food rations. Stores wouldn't allow her to enter, even when she was wearing masks and a mask and gloves. And so she really bore the double burden of being both a migrant and a Muslim in India.
You mentioned earlier that the government's response to the crisis was reprehensible. My reading of this story is that the authorities saw some of the most vulnerable people in society as essentially collateral damage when implementing this lockdown, and that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people suffered because the government entirely failed to consider their needs. Is this a fair criticism of the government?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and it's one that I hope I make in the piece as well. That's a fair criticism, not only for a decision to implement the lockdown in this way, but also for the lack of an adequate response in the weeks after, when the scale of devastation was really visible. I had spoken to Dr. Srivastava for this piece. He's an economist and he's been working on migrant issues for many years now. Because I was also trying to understand how a government could afford to be so negligent towards such a large section of the country. And he pointed out two things. One is Modi's strongman leadership, where it's top-down governance with negligible consultations. And we saw this in 2016 with demonetization, where Modi announced that all 500 rupee and 1,000 rupee notes were invalid overnight, which was a bid to clamp down on corruption, but really adversely affected lower income families and people who survived on a cash-based economy. And we saw it again now with the lockdown announcement, which, if he had given the country even 1 week to prepare, we may not have had a crisis of this scale. The other thing that Dr. Srivastava pointed out was that even when the crisis was clear, there was no serious effort to consult with policy experts or people in the sector to try and deal with the damage. And instead, they approached it as a law and order problem and, sort of unleashed the police on people. And, with a crisis of this scale, there's only so much that NGOs can do, that civil society can do. The only entity that could have made a large-scale difference was the government. But instead, we just got really infuriating examples of how little they cared. We had a food stock buffer of 77 million tons of grain. That's more than 3 times the buffer stock requirement. But a month into the lockdown, only 2.2 of that 77 million tons had been distributed to states. And instead, the government had released food grain to be converted to ethanol to make hand sanitizers. If we look at the relief packages that were announced, they included things that were already committed to public spending. Money was promised to people, but no one could access banks or ATMs for 6 weeks into the lockdown. Migrants were being beaten up if they were on the roads. And in the meanwhile, our chief economic advisor said that this proved that there was no rural distress because people had not withdrawn money from their bank accounts. We had Indian citizens who were stuck abroad and they were flown back. The government arranged for evacuation flights at public expense. But workers in India were stranded in cities for more than a month. These are all indications of policy that's oriented towards certain classes. Even the prevention measures and the kind of rhetoric in Modi's speeches to the nation really signaled the government's priority that was based on a class divide, because they did seem to feel like there's no political cost to treating migrants, treating farmers, treating Dalits, Muslims, lower income families as dispensable.
And there was the shocking figure I mentioned earlier of at least 80 people dying on these overcrowded trains the government put on to get migrant workers home. And of course, just to be clear, many people died on the roads. These are people walking day and night on busy roads. You spoke to someone who lost their husband, of course. This was clearly, at best, seriously mismanaged, at worst, barely managed at all. Is anyone taking responsibility for this failure of governance? Is there any possibility of an inquiry? Is there any likelihood that someone in government will pay a political price for this failure?
I'm glad it's clear that there has been a failure of governance, because unfortunately the way the narrative has been constructed here and packaged to people is different. The crisis has been portrayed by state officials and also by certain sections of the media as tragedy and a calamity, but not necessarily as a result of thoughtless policy decisions, and not something that we need to demand action from the government to address. In the initial case filed with the Supreme Court at the end of March, the Solicitor General blamed the migrant crisis on fake news. He said that the media was spreading fake news about the duration of the lockdown, and that's what caused migrants to panic and leave cities. There were several public interest litigations that were filed by lawyers and activists, and those were dismissed. And it was only 2 months later, after it was difficult to ignore the scale of the crisis, that the Supreme Court took suo motu cognizance of it and ordered the central and state governments to undertake relief measures and ensure that migrants had a safe passage home. The problem with accountability in this situation is that we don't have the numbers. The government is not providing any substantial information on how many people were affected. So when MPs press the center on how many migrant workers had died during the lockdown, they were told that no such data is available. So it doesn't look like there's been any significant political cost to this government. But I think we also need to understand the context in which this crisis took place. There's a certain amount of distraction, a certain amount of sleight of hand that the government is also carrying out. There was a concentrated focus in media coverage on the Tablighi Jamaat and on this idea of Muslims spreading the virus. Modi was asking people to light diyas and bang utensils. He had army helicopters flying over hospitals, showering petals over it. Police were categorized as corona warriors, even as they beat migrants up on the streets. And Modi's rhetoric was focused on unity and patriotism and sacrifice. So critiquing the government then becomes unpatriotic. Meanwhile, the central government has been using this lockdown not just to erase any remnants of the nationwide protests that were ongoing before the pandemic, but also to arrest anyone who had dissented. So we saw the arrests of students, of lawyers, of human rights activists, and of journalists, anyone who had been vocal critics of the government. It's to a point where even NGOs are worried. For this story, I had to send the NGO that I had mentioned a copy of the article beforehand because they were so anxious about the possible political ramifications of them even being mentioned in an article that was critical of Modi's India. So it's also a difficult time to demand responsibility and demand accountability from the people in power.
Mm. And this crisis, of course, has shown us just how vulnerable low-paid workers are in India. Losing a job can very rapidly lose to homelessness and hunger due to the complete lack of any kind of safety net. Has the crisis shifted the national conversation about social security and workers' rights at all?
Um, yeah, like you mentioned, what this crisis has done is reveal an existing problem, right? Migrants have always been in this very vulnerable position. And there are many people and many organizations who have recommendations and policy changes and plans for, the expansion and improvement on social security. And they've been around for decades. So I think the question is maybe not about shifting the conversation, but prioritizing it. One of those recommendations that was attempted in 2011 is now being taken on, which is the portability of ration cards that allows you to buy food grains at lower prices. So the government is launching the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme to help to ensure that migrants who leave their states will still be able to use that ration card in another state. So that's supposed to be implemented by March 2021. The parliament has also revised labor codes, but unfortunately, the new labor codes sort of weaken accountability and actually tilt the scales towards employers rather than safeguarding workers' interests. So, for example, working hours were strictly defined as 8 hours a day, whereas now the code allows for government discretion in defining the workday. There's a social security code has created a welfare fund for construction workers. So many interstate migrant workers do work in construction, but there's a lack of clarity on whether that's portable from state to state. And, construction workers migrate from place to place because they're tied to the contractors. And in the meantime, many states have suspended their labor laws in order to improve the economy. And there's no real incentive for states to maintain data on migrant workers, which is what's desperately needed. We need a national database of migrant workers and a separate welfare fund. We need checks and balances to ensure that this shadow population doesn't exist on the fringes anymore. But instead, we're sort of getting reforms that are meant to kickstart the economy through deregulation and privatization and a dilution of the labor laws.
A couple of questions about India's fight against COVID-19. Firstly, how successful was this March lockdown? that caused such great upheaval for the internal migrant workers? And also, what does 2021 look like for India's fight against the virus? Are the migrant workers that you spoke to likely to be vaccinated sometime next year?
So to the question of whether the lockdown was effective, no, it was a massive failure. At the start of the lockdown, we had 564 cases, and when they lifted, we had 173,000 cases. And right now we're at 9.7 million. We're just after the US in the highest number of cases worldwide. And the failure is visible if you look at any other country's graph of cases versus the lockdown. Countries impose a lockdown like here, and then the peak happens, and then they lift it over here. India, we imposed it here, and then lifted it right when it was peaking. So it was a hasty decision, and one that failed to take into account the socioeconomic context of India. 80% of our workforce is in the informal sector. So the consequences of this were obviously going to be much worse for us. And I think the point of lockdowns is not to eradicate the virus, but the point is to buy time so that measures can be taken to handle the caseloads better. But there was actually very limited funds made available for public expenditure, and the responsibility was placed on state governments to respond. In terms of India's fight against COVID-19, so we are actually the world's leading vaccine manufacturer, and Serum Institute of India is producing the Oxford vaccine, which they're aiming to make available by April 2021. There's also an indigenous vaccine by Bharat Biotech, and we have 6 other candidates, including the Pfizer vaccine. The issue India has is with distribution. So it'll require an expansion of India's cold chain capacity and, addressing the existing gaps in the vaccine distribution network. But in terms of migrants, I think unfortunately we might see the same issues that impede them from getting food rations and state benefits coming into play, because there's very limited data on how many migrant workers have come back to the cities. Many of them don't have ration cards, they don't have any registered identification. So it's going to be a massive task trying to reach every last person.
I'll ask one final question before we hand over to the audience. So if you do have any questions for Nadia, now is the final chance to get them over to Marcus, aka questions. Nadia, have you kept in touch with any of the migrant workers you spoke to for this story? How are they doing? Is it 7, 8, or 9 months on? Have many migrant workers returned to the cities from their home villages?
So it was a bit difficult to reach them. Ronak, who I'd mentioned, she's still living with her family in Hazaribagh. Neither her nor her husband have any work, and they're really struggling even now. So it was difficult to reach her because they didn't have enough money to recharge her phone. So she had to call me from a neighbor's phone or something, and she was telling me about how, it was difficult even for NGO workers to get in touch with her because of this issue. And she's young. She has a BA degree. She used to tutor children in the city, but the only job opportunities that the government has provided under the National Rural NREG, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So that gives people 120 days of guaranteed work and guaranteed income, and the only work available to her is manual labor. So it's also a question of, are people going to sort of slip back into daily wage labor? Kusum, the woman whose husband passed away, she got some money from the government for her husband's death, and she's also applied for widow's pension, so she has some cushioning financially. And so she and her sons have moved to Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh to find work again, because there's no work in the villages. And that's really the issue, right? The situation hasn't changed for so many migrants. We don't have much data, but surveys conducted by NGOs and think tanks tell us that 2/3 of migrants either want to return to cities or have already returned to cities because there's just no work in their home states. Many families have debt piling up. They've taken loans from money lenders, so they have no choice but to find work. And I was reading in one of the reports that this migrant worker said that they left because they didn't want to die alone in cities away from their families. And now they've come back because they're better off dying while earning money rather than dying while watching their families starve. So that's the situation that they're in right
now. Marcus, do we have any questions from the audience?
We've got lots of questions and some fantastic ones as well. I'm going to kick off with one from Javier, who asked. He said, in the piece you mentioned Kerala having small amounts of aid, which is helping some people, and Javier was wondering what was the collaboration between the state and central government on things like aid packages, or on a wider response to this, or were the two operating pretty much independently?
Yeah, I mean, the state government kind of announced relief packages. 90% of people surveyed, migrants surveyed, said they still hadn't received the food rations and the direct cash transfer that were promised from the central governments about 6 months after the lockdown was announced. In terms of state governments, a lot of the responsibility was therefore placed on them. So it really depended on which state you lived in, and the economic disparity of state governments also dictated how people were treated. With the Kerala government, the minister actually said that he sort of made an assurance that no one would starve to death in his state, which is pretty stark. But also that was the kind of reassurance that people needed, and they didn't really get it from other governments. In terms of the major responsibility on state governments was to initiate the transfer of migrants, to sort of help them get back to their home states. And rather than coordinate this as the center, they sort of let the home state and the employer state try to coordinate, which resulted in a lot of inefficiency, a lot of back and forth, and unnecessary deaths.
And another question from Fabio this time, which was, are COVID cases concentrated in specific areas or states? And was a national lockdown actually required in theory? Would a more targeted local approach have been more effective?
Yeah, it was. So the cases were contained to certain states and certain urban areas. So no, a nationwide lockdown was really not necessary. In fact, state governments had already imposed their own sort of statewide lockdown before the national lockdown was announced. And people, critics of Modi, sort of say that the the national announcement was made so that the government didn't look like they weren't responding in a timely manner, and so instead they just made this really aggressive. It's almost like the worst case situation option, and that's what they jumped to without taking any steps beforehand. Yeah.
And that leads into a question actually from James, who was kind of saying he was interested in the context of which this kind of announcement was made with the 4 hours notice, and kind of like what did they hope to get out of it? What did they expect to happen?
That would be guesswork on my part. In his speech, Modi was very adamant about this 21 day. We will defeat coronavirus in 21 days. I'm not sure if government officials actually believed that, or if they were just, saying it to reassure people. But what did they hope to achieve? I think they hoped to look like they were being very decisive, and they were being very strong in their policy decisions, and they were protecting the Indian voters that they cared about, which is the upper and middle classes. And so it was this sort of understanding of like, you protect yourself and your families, you stay in your homes, and if you don't have one, then you're on your own.
I've got a question from Jenny, which was globally we've seen a rise in domestic violence. It's kind of been known as the shadow pandemic. I was wondering if you'd observed any of that in your reporting in India.
Yeah. So the sources that I spoke to, there weren't any cases of domestic violence, but I had also spoken to a lot of NGO workers, a lot of people who were manning helplines. In the NGO that I mentioned in the piece, they had a separate helpline for, with mental health practitioners on the phone for domestic violence cases and sexual violence. And we saw a lot of that happen, especially with migrant women, especially if they didn't speak the language in the state that they were in. There was sexual violence, the cases of sexual violence in factories, in sites where they were working, as well as, of course, domestic violence cases. I mean, just generally in the country were on the rise. And so a lot of those helpline workers really had to deal with the mental health crisis that kind of went unaddressed in Indian media, at least.
A question from Richard, who also wanted me to point out that the reporting is excellent and he found the story heartbreaking. But he asked, what are the things that would have the biggest impact to either stop or reduce the impact of this happening to interstate migrant workers again, for healthcare or other shocks? And are people doing anything to address that?
I mean, there are several things that can be done. One is to just, like I said, get data on migrant workers so we know how many people there are, where they are, how to reach out to help them. in terms of healthcare, in terms of nutrition, I think is going to be a huge issue in the years to come. And the expansion of the PDS system, which is the system with which they access food grains at a subsidized price, that will definitely help. And we also need, not just laws that protect them, but laws that are implemented well. The issue with the laws right now is that there are enough loopholes for companies to sort of get out of treating migrant workers with the same benefits and securities that they give to their contractual employees. So you'd see if contractors are responsible for workers, they'd sort of give that responsibility to subcontractors to then find workers, so they aren't held accountable. So I think we need to have a sort of framework, a legal framework, and a framework that works in real life, to sort of hold people more accountable to how they treat their workers.
A question from Rahil, which was, thank you for telling this story and doing it in a heart-wrenching yet data-driven way. How do you approach your journalism in an environment increasingly hostile to government criticism?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I think, it's a journalist's job to tell the truth. And the truth is that this government responded to this crisis and responded to a vast majority of its citizens in a really reprehensible way. And I wouldn't know how to report this story without saying that. I think journalists have to take care. I think they're on guard in India, especially because they're being arrested, over tweets even. So it is a scary time to be vocal about criticism against Modi and against the government. But, the flip side of that argument is that now is the most important time to invest in journalism that asks those questions that are necessary. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think it certainly does. And this is the last one that we've got time for, which is along a similar line actually, which is kind of how important is it for journalism to keep having a voice in modern day India?
It's increasingly difficult. A lot of publications are not able to sustain themselves in this economy that's been, compounded by the pandemic. A lot of critical, responsible publications have shut down. So I think the problem is also that the outlets for reporting is just, reducing at a rapid pace. But of course it's important. Especially because, we see the TV anchors and other sections of media really just going along with the sort of misinformation campaign that this government is peddling to people. And so, if it means drawing international attention to what's going on and, writing for publications that aren't necessarily in India, maybe that's a way to combat it. But I think, the only thing we can do is to continue speaking out.
I couldn't agree more. And with that, I will hand you back to Matthew just to close things up. But thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. They were fantastic.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for joining us. I know it's pretty late there in Mumbai. so we'll let you go to bed. It's a really fascinating article, and we hope to feature your work again in DG in the future. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We'll be doing this again in the near future. I probably don't need to tell you what time of year it is, but a certain festive celebration is coming, and it would be amiss of me not to let you know that we sell a wonderful, there we go. There's our subscription message. Delayed gratification makes a brilliant Christmas gift to friends and family. If you would like to give it as a gift that keeps on giving throughout 2021, use the code SLOWHOHO for 15% off. And we cannot do this without you. And Delayed Gratification is an advertising-free, reader-funded magazine, and your subscriptions help fund articles like Nadia's. So thank you so much for your ongoing support. I hope everyone has a very lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.